Good morning, boys and girls, and welcome back to our typical routine. We are going to continue with normal classes just virtually for the rest of the week. In history, we're starting a brand new unit, which is going to really connect well to the last unit that we had. Actually, the last two units we had. So we heard about exploration of North America most recently in history. So we heard about explorers coming through from Europe into North America, especially focusing on the United States, but also Canada. So we also heard about the Native American tribes that settled into parts of the United States. We're going to be hearing today about, the start of this new unit that we're going to continue with for the rest of the year, on the 13 colonies. So the original colonies that became the foundation of what the United States is today. So we've heard about the early stages of that, all of the people who explored different parts of America and settled into North America. But the country that we are in today and its foundation, especially the way that the government is run, but also where people live in these urban areas, a lot of that is due to the colonization that we're going to hear about. It's not connected as much to the Native American tribes that we heard about earlier. So starting a brand new book, 13 Colonies. Just like the others, I do have a PDF that I'll have online so that you can access it at any time. And I will be presenting that and following along. As you can see, I've got a little skeleton buddy here for science class as well. Okay, let's go to our textbook now. Chapter 1, the English Colonies. Okay, before we begin, I'd love to think through some things that maybe you already know about the 13 colonies. Do you know what some of them are? You'll see some details of each colony. I know that maybe in first grade, correct me about that if I'm wrong, you learned some details about the 13 colonies. We'll get into more depth in this third grade year. Now, why do you think people came to settle in these English colonies? Why did people start to come live in the United States? Well, we're going to get into that now with our book. So as you can see, that's our big question. That's our focus of the chapter. Now, the United States began as a group of 13 colonies, English colonies. These 13 colonies did not begin all at once. Explorers and traders came first. So that's what we've heard about. We also know that before the Europeans came through, that there were Native Americans living there. Now, slowly over time, the colonies were created. The first colony was founded in Virginia, in 1607. So Virginia, not the whole state as we know today, but that was the first one that was colonized by the English. The last of the 13 colonies that was founded was Georgia in 1732. Now, the first European settlers came here from England. They brought with them everything they owned. When the settlers arrived, they had no family to greet them. Sometimes the Native Americans who already lived in North America welcomed the settlers. Other times, however, the Native Americans were not happy to see newcomers settling on their land. There were no houses to live in, so many of the first settlers lived in tents. Some even lived in caves to survive, like the mound builders, similar to that. Their living conditions were harsh, especially during the winter. Many died of hunger, cold, and disease. We heard about some of this in our Thanksgiving book that we read earlier in the year. This shows the first English settlers hoping to find a new life in the colonies. Here they are in those tents, but they're starting to build up kind of a fortress. Now, even though life in the early colonies could be hard, most settlers did not return to England. They started a new life in a new place instead. Now, why do you think these English came? Why would they come from England to America to start a new life? separating themselves from everything they were familiar with and from all the people that they knew. Now, early settlers had different reasons for coming to America. Some people came because they had been very poor before in their homeland. In England and other countries, there were often not enough jobs or land. The new colonies needed a lot of workers, and as far as the settlers were concerned, there was enough land for everyone who wanted to stay. People who settle in a new place on behalf of another country are called colonists. The settlers were, in fact, colonists. So it's people who come in on behalf of another country. The Romans did this, right? They had places set up as they were branching outside of Rome into other territories. So those are basically colonists as well. And many of you talk about that happening in India several hundred years ago as well. Now, some colonists came because they thought they could get rich in America. Some hoped to find gold and silver. Others hoped that farming would make them wealthy. Some were people who had broken the law in England, and as part of their punishment, they were sent to the colonies in North America, which we saw with Eric the Red, right? So lots of different reasons. Maybe they were very poor before in their homeland. We were thinking there's all of this land and opportunity to get rich from either farming or finding really wonderful natural resources like gold and silver. Or maybe they were punished and sent there. As you can see, and this is kind of the dream of what people thought might happen to them as they came to this new land. Here is an image that says, even though it was not easy to live in the colonies, many people believed they would have a better life. We see some Native Americans and some Europeans as the ships are coming through. Now, some colonists came for religious reasons too, which is one of the most common ones that we talk about with the original colonies. In England, not everyone could practice their religion in the way that they wanted to. Some people came to America because they wanted to worship in their own way. Primarily, they were all Christians. It was just that they wanted to worship in a slightly different way. We would call that different denominations. So they believed basically the same things, but they wanted to be able to practice in the ways that they were interested in. So for these colonists, living in a land where they could have religious freedom was very important. And that probably rings a bell because, as we're going to get into with American history, that became a huge part of its foundation. Now, not everyone who crossed the Atlantic Ocean found opportunity and freedom. As the colonies developed and grew larger, some people from Africa were forced to settle in America. They did not choose to settle here. Instead, they were kidnapped from their homes and brought across the ocean to be enslaved workers. So sadly, not everyone had this choice. Just like we heard about with some people being banished for breaking the law, there were also people who were kidnapped. They hadn't done anything wrong, but they were kidnapped and brought across to be slaves because people were so desperate for workers, but selfishly didn't want to continue paying for them. And that was very common at the time, sadly. Now, New England colonies. The map shows that the colonies were divided into 3 groups or regions. As you can see here, what do you notice about these 3 regions? You see this key? New England, Middle, and Southern. And if you compare it to the map behind me or the map that maybe you have in your head of what America looks like, you know that these states are, many of them, much smaller than what we would have today. So it was just a small section, and you might notice they're all right along the Atlantic Ocean coast. They're coming right from England directly to these areas, and that's where they settled, as far south as Georgia. Now, the New England colonies, where do you see New England on the map? You see what color it is? That's right, pink. Okay, so there we go. Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut. Have any of you been over to those states before? Do you know what this state actually is today? It's not Massachusetts. Look at that. There's two Massachusetts. Those were all together. Now that's the state of Maine. We also see here New France, Quebec, and the St. Lawrence River. We just heard about that with Champlain, right? So it says they included Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. Originally, there was another colony in New England called Plymouth, which you'll read about later. And we also read about at Thanksgiving time with a specific book. Now, Plymouth eventually became part of Massachusetts. In New England, the winters were long and cold. The soil was rocky. The short growing season and poor soil made it difficult for the colonists to grow crops there. So, long cold winters, rocky soil, that is not good for New England. Now, usually New England colonists grew only enough vegetables and grain to feed their own families. So this is different than the Wilders. You know how the Wilders sell their, we've seen them sell butter so far, and what else? Lots of crops, I think, as well, or we're getting to some of that very soon. So they sell things to other people. It's not just about providing for their own family. They build their wealth. So usually those New England colonists at the time, they only grew enough for themselves. They were unable to grow extra food to sell to others. Just like today, the New England region had a long coastline with many natural harbors, places for them to dock. As you can see here, it's a part of a body of water that is next to land and provides a safe place for ships to anchor. Fish were plentiful in these waters and in the coastal waters. When the colonists first arrived, they found many forests in the region. The colonists cut down trees for timber. They used the timber to build ships, houses, and other buildings. Timber is wood cut from trees. As you can see, like this is timber right here. They cut that down from a natural resource of the wood from the forests to use for their own building. Timber was also used for firewood. As the colonies grew, trading ships sailed in and out of the busy New England harbors. The ships carried timber to the West Indies, the Caribbean, and Europe. So that helps. If they can start trading things, selling it off to other people, then that allows them to have extra money, they can grow wealthier, and they're allowed the money to be able to buy things that they can't make on their own. Now, the middle colonies. The colonies in the middle region, let's go back here, were called the middle colonies. You see which ones are going to be the middle colonies? Yeah, these green ones. New York, that's where Almanzo lives. Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware. That's right. Now, winters in the middle colonies were not as long and cold as winters in New England. Warm, rainy summers and fertile soil made growing crops much easier in this region. So it makes sense that Almanzo and his family are successful farmers there. Colonists in the middle colonies could grow enough food to feed themselves and still have crops left over to sell, just like Almanzo. Now, the middle colonies also had a coastline for fishing and ports for ships. So New England had good fishing and good timber, which they could sell off. That was the wood. Now the middle colonies here, what do they have? They don't have as bad of winters, so they can have better crops that they sell off. They have enough that they can provide for themselves and others so that they can become wealthier. And they also have fishing and ports for ships so that allows them to trade more easily. Now, finally, the southern colonies. Let's see these. Okay, much larger section down here. We've got Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia, or at least parts of what we now have as those states. As you can see, it says Yorktown and Jamestown. Those are going to be significant to us soon. So the southern colonies were perfect for farming. They had mild winters and fertile soil. Crops grew so well that some colonists built large farms called plantations. Many plantations grew large amounts of a single crop that was then sold to make a profit. So the Wilders, they don't have a plantation. They have a large farm, enough for themselves and to sell to make a profit. But plantations were much, much larger. And rather than, how the Wilders have a little bit of a lot of different crops, plantations would focus on just one. And sadly, a lot of those are the ones that had the enslaved workers that came in. Now, port cities. As more people from England and other European countries came to America, the colonists built towns that often grew into cities. You heard of Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Charleston? Huge cities. These cities became known as port cities. This is because they were built along waterways or on harbors on the coast. They were able to get ships that came in from Europe and other continents, but especially Europe since there were English colonies here. But they also might have been well positioned to be able to trade into more of the middle of the United States. The colonists used waterways for transportation. Now, port cities became centers for trade too. They also became places where news and information were shared. Do you remember that with Farmer Boy? We've seen some people come through. Who was it most recently that was sharing information? It might have been the Tin Peddler who would come through, and the family was so excited to hear from him because he was able to give them information about what's happening in the rest of their counties, surrounding counties, maybe other parts of the state altogether. And the butter buyer, I think, was that way too. The butter buyer would give some information about like New York City. So ships traveling between the port cities kept the colonies connected with each other. They don't have cell phones to share this information. So it's through word of mouth that they could hear from somebody else what was happening in their home country. And new ideas spread from the port cities throughout the colonies. One of the ideas that developed over time was that the colonists could govern themselves, meaning it doesn't have to be England governing them, just like in ancient Rome for a long time until there was finally pushback. It was Rome controlling everything within the Roman Empire. Well, for a long time, England was controlling everything here in the colonies, even though eventually, about the Revolutionary War later on, they pushed back and did not want to have somebody else governing them. When you learn about the American Revolution, it says you'll read about how the colonists fought to create an independent nation. Okay, so next week we're going to start on the Virginia colony. We'll get into some depth with each of these main colonies and what was unique about them, how they developed, and so on. That was just an overview of the English colonies in general, though. So what are some of the reasons why people came to settle in the English colonies? You think of some reasons for why that happened? They wanted money. They wanted an opportunity for greater wealth in farming and trading. They also, many of them wanted to have the opportunity to maybe escape their former country because of wanting religious freedom. And some people were forced to come to this country, along with many other reasons. But that gives you a little bit of an overview of the 13 colonies, which we're going to get into over the next couple of months, actually. Okay, I hope you have an enjoyable rest of your day. I will talk to you later. Bye.